Hey everyone, as you know, I debunk many flavors of pseudoscientific propaganda, but one thing I have yet to tackle is climate change denial, as so many of you frequently remind me. Well, the long wait is finally over. It's time to dig into this quagmire of ignorance and deception, so let's get started. Part of the reason I put this topic off for so long is that it's difficult to select a target. There are so many people spouting climate change denial, and there's no clear ringleader among them, like Graham Hancock for pseudoarchaeology or Andrew Wakefield for anti-vaxxers. But one person that's received a lot of attention lately is Matt Ridley, and I figured this was as good an opportunity as any to sink my teeth into this topic. So who is Matt Ridley? He's a British fellow who studied zoology, but then became a science writer, journalist, and businessman. Basically, he's a jerk who writes bullshit for a living. He was a big supporter of Brexit, and he has a long history of bullying scientists in various fields that he's clueless about. While this video will focus on his current tirade against well-established principles of climate science, many people know him from his misadventures attacking the biomedical community with books like Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. He has promoted the idea that the HIV pandemic was caused by a vaccine leak. He claimed that patient zero for COVID was a specific laboratory scientist in Wuhan with zero basis, and refused to retract the claim when intelligence agencies proved him wrong. He accused epidemiologist Neil Ferguson of exaggerating risk from SARS coronavirus 2 and plotting to influence COVID-19 policy. He underestimated COVID deaths in Sweden by an order of magnitude. He claimed nutrition scientists funded a conspiracy to falsely claim that saturated fat had health risks. He also said he'd accept the results of randomized controlled trials as evaluated by the Cochrane Research Group, and then ignored Cochrane's most recent analysis that confirmed saturated fat had health risks. In this video, we're going to examine everything you just heard in detail, and quite a lot more, but we can already see that Matt's main strategy is to make up a bunch of false claims, cite garbage sources to try and substantiate the claims, baselessly assert that scientists engaged in a cover-up of those false claims, and then refuse to admit he was wrong no matter how conclusively he is proven wrong and by whom. With this climate change denial, in addition to selling shitty books full of lies, there is the additional through line of his formal ties to big energy, specifically the coal industry. To give you the quick summary, the Shotton surface coal mine is located on land that Matt owns, and he made £4 million a year from that. Yeah, he's super rich. He's a Viscount. What the fuck is a Viscount, you ask? It's a high ranking in the British nobility, just above Baron and just below Earl. What the fuck are Barons and Earls? We don't have time for that. Go watch Bridgerton or something. The point is that he made a lot of money from the coal industry, which is why he lied about climate change, so that the coal industry continues to thrive and he could keep making lots of money. That's right, lying for money. Nothing new or shocking. Of course, he will deny this conflict of interest like any good fraud would. Here's what he said in July of this year.
To be fair, I actually did make money out of coal for quite a long time. On my land, there were, of course, coal mines. I was very careful never to speak in favor of coal, but mainly to speak in favor of gas during that period, even though gas was a rival to coal for the electricity market. Now that there's no coal produced from my land, and there won't be, and again in the future, I can now say what I really think, which is that coal is a good thing. And I was, so if anything, my vested interest was holding me back before that.
Wow, what an honest guy. When making money from coal, he advocated for his competitor. Now he totally doesn't make money on coal at all, so he is free to talk about how super awesome coal is. There's no way that he still has deep ties to coal and is shilling for coal. That would make him some kind of a lying fraud. He gets real testy if you point out his coal money on Twitter. 6 years since he's owned the site of a coal mine. Plus, he didn't even speak in favor of coal back when he was all about coal. Except that's a lie. In 2016, he was lobbying for coal. Reading from The Guardian. An influential conservative member of the House of Lords has been accused of lobbying the government for the benefit of the coal industry, despite previously saying he does not argue for the industry's interests. Because of all this lobbying, he has acquired the nickname Matt King Coal. For all you young folks who don't get the reference, it's a play on the name of famous singer Nat King Cole. Yep, advisor to a secretly funded charity, one-man think tank, promotes fossil fuels while profiting off of coal, more info about how insanely rich the guy is, you get the picture. So when a guy says he's not doing something that he definitely is doing, what do we call that person? Oh yeah, a liar. Matt Ridley is a liar. He lies about climate change for money. Let's highlight some more examples that demonstrate why nobody should trust a word he says. There was the time he defended climate change denier Dr. Willie Soon. Reading from his blog, the astrophysicist Willie Soon was falsely accused by a Greenpeace activist of failing to disclose conflicts of interest to an academic journal, an accusation widely repeated by mainstream media. Well, Matt failed to mention that Willie was paid by the fossil fuel industry, failed to properly disclose it, and then had to write a corrigendum correcting his lack of disclosure. There is plenty of documentation here very clearly outlining how Willie's papers were deliverables to fossil fuel executives. Reading from one article, between 2008 and 2011, Soon solicited fossil fuel interests to pay for studies that show how the sun affects climate change and other climate denial perspectives, according to the documents and other public records obtained by Greenpeace and the Climate Investigations Center. The companies were ExxonMobil, the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, Southern Company Services, and Donors Trust Incorporated, an organization that facilitates contributions largely toward conservative causes from donors who wish to remain anonymous. The studies were called deliverables to funders. Willie had to issue a corrigendum, basically a correction, thereby admitting his prior lack of disclosure. Willie is a shill, so Matt will tell you an obvious shill is not a shill and try to shift the blame to that stupid corrupt media. Not a great look. Oh, check out this other blatant lie.
But if you look at what's happening in our media, with a lot of paid journalism as much as anything else, and in the world of activism and in the world of politics, there is huge sums of money sluicing through the environmental movement and reaching people who are paid to push a particular angle. And that angle is always anti-fossil fuels, pro-renewables, pro-catastrophism, anti-nuclear, these kinds of things. Well, not always anti-nuclear, but some of it is still. So it's the money on the anti-fossil fuel side of the ledger is way more than the money on the pro-fossil fuel side of the ledger.
Yeah, all the money is on the anti-fossil fuel side, you guys. Those powerful multinational energy conglomerates are no match for broke environmental activists. They're shills for renewable energy. Give me a fucking break. Let's read from this 2018 paper on the climate lobby. This paper provides an estimate of lobbying expenditures related to climate change legislation in the U.S. Congress from 2000 to 2016. During this time period, over $2 billion was spent on this activity, constituting 3.9% of total lobbying expenditures. Major sectors involved in lobbying were fossil fuel and transportation corporations, utilities, and affiliated trade associations. Expenditures by these sectors dwarf those of environmental organizations and renewable energy corporations. Yes, fossil fuels and related industries spent $2 billion trying to squash any and all regulations of their activity based on legitimate climate concerns, because they like money more than humans. Shocking, isn't it? So when Matt pretends the precise opposite is true, that would make him what? Oh yeah, a fucking liar. And when Matt repeatedly claims he's not making money on coal anymore, even though that's exactly what a shill for coal would say, should we believe him? If you want to believe a proven liar, go right ahead. Anyway, we've made an important point here in exposing Matt's deception and agenda, one that absolutely had to be made at the top of the video. But apart from simply pointing at his financial motives, we also have to demonstrate that everything Matt says about climate change is objectively wrong. And those of you who watch my content know that I will now do this with a level of detail and reference to primary scientific literature that will be borderline irritating. But that's just what we have to do. When frauds like Matt come along and put forward a scholarly facade, pretending to reference cutting-edge science and expose corruption in whatever field they're attacking, in order to spread lies about vaccines or evolution or climate change, they must be met with even greater diligence. All of their citations must be investigated, and all of their claims must be debunked, with an order of magnitude more legitimate science than they attempt to reference. But before we dive into this lengthy process, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor. We all want a reliable method of finding accurate information on the internet, especially when it comes to science. Google searches turn up a combination of fact and SEO-driven fiction, leaving us with more questions than answers. Direct scientific literature searches with Google Scholar or PubMed connect you to research papers, but they can be very hard to read, with many behind a paywall. Thus enters Consensus. Consensus is a new wave academic search engine that leverages AI and vector search to find and synthesize the best science for you. Consensus searches across 200 million scientific papers from the highest quality journals, and presents referenced information to you in easily digestible fashion. Just ask it any question, like, I don't know, is global warming accelerating? Well, look at that, a resounding 100% yes. Within seconds, we are reading a concise summary, key findings from major studies, and a firm conclusion. But that's not the end of the investigation. Consensus pulls up the literature that is most relevant to the question, extracts key insights from each paper, and gives you a study snapshot which summarizes experimental data, methodology, and relevant outcomes. Get the big picture in a flash, and then choose which papers to read if you need more detail. You can do this with any question you have. You don't even need to know the precise keywords because of how vector searches work. Give it specific prompts combined with your search. Ask for the mechanisms of action, or how two concepts correlate with each other, or to explain a topic in simple language. Whatever you need in truly any area of academic study, from economics to anthropology. Is the gut microbiome linked to depression? What's the best treatment for acne? How does a cricket chirp? Whether you're a PhD candidate in climate science, or just a curious Jack or Jill trying to make sense of today's news, Consensus is for you. Join over 2 million people who have already switched to smarter, faster, and more reliable information sourcing. Try Consensus for free, or unlock 1 month of Pro free with my link, get.consensus.app/Professor Dave Explains. Pro supercharges your research with more deep searches and unlimited Pro analyses. Go to consensus.app and jump straight into your first search today. Now back to the debunking. First, let's start by discussing the term climate change denier. You know how RFK, the world's most influential anti-vaxxer, publicly claims he's not an anti-vaxxer? Climate change deniers do this as well. Matt Ridley, the climate change denier, refuses to accept that label because he has a better shot at getting his propaganda past the radar of reasonable people if he pretends what he's saying isn't just science denial, even though that's exactly what it is. With figures like Matt, it's not stupidity or inquisitiveness or even ignorance that drives their rhetoric. It's a deep commitment to deny what the evidence shows for monetary reasons. Scholars from across numerous disciplines acknowledge that Matt is a climate change denier. Here's Andrew Dessler, climate scientist and professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M, talking about Matt's lukewarmism, a concept we will get to in a moment. Here's pediatrician Paul Offit commenting on the shitty book Matt wrote with co-author Alina Chan.
She wrote a book called Viral, Search for the Origin of COVID-19, which she wrote with Matt Ridley, who interestingly is a climate change denier.
Matt hates this very accurate, abusive term, so he lashed out in response with the obligatory mot to his Bailey, which we will elucidate sequentially as we go. The main strategy that will be employed here is to show how Matt consistently refuses to accept evidence-based conclusions surrounding this topic, and we need a touch of background information to do that. So let's start with a brief evidence-based introduction to human-caused or anthropogenic global warming, also known as AGW. Human activity releases aerosols. These are suspensions of fine solid particles or liquid droplets in gas, such as air. These might be sulfate aerosols, black carbon aerosols, or others. Sulfate aerosols reflect sunlight back into space, cooling the Earth. Black carbon aerosols instead absorb sunlight, warming the Earth. And we also produce greenhouse gases, which are gases that absorb and emit radiant energy within the thermal infrared range. So as radiation from the sun is reflected back into space, these gases reflect a portion of it back to Earth and slow the Earth's release of energy, thereby heating the Earth, which is called the greenhouse effect, since the gases in the atmosphere act similarly to the glass in a greenhouse that traps heat in. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is such a greenhouse gas. Increases in greenhouse gases and black carbon aerosols, along with sulfate aerosol decreases, cause an energy imbalance in which Earth releases less energy than it takes in. This is what is described by the term radiative forcing, or the change in Earth's energy balance by factors that affect how much solar energy is absorbed or radiated by the planet. Here is a figure depicting radiative forcing over time and the breakdown by individual component. We can see the rise becoming sharper after the Industrial Revolution, and then much sharper still around the 1960s, to get to where we are today, and this purple curve indicates that carbon dioxide is responsible for the lion's share of the process. Radiative forcing is calculated in units of watts per square meter, or the amount of energy per unit time, per unit of Earth's surface area. We've caused around 3 watts per square meter so far. This energy imbalance causes warming. The more sensitive Earth's climate is to the energy imbalance, the more warming that occurs. You can see the same general process in daily life. For example, microwaving a bowl of soup causes the bowl and soup to take in more energy than they release. The bowl warms up, but the soup warms up even more because the soup is more sensitive to the energy imbalance, given how different substances interact with microwaves differently, in particular all the water molecules in the soup. Reading from this 2023 paper, our study shows that we can directly monitor the radiative impact, forcing plus feedback, of greenhouse gas concentration changes. So we are not in the dark here. We are very much on top of precisely what is causing the warming. Reading from this 2025 paper, serving as an annual update on climate and human influence, human-induced warming, also known as anthropogenic warming, refers to the component of observed global surface temperature increase attributable to both the direct and indirect effects of human activities, which are typically grouped as follows. Well-mixed GHGs, consisting of CO2, CH4, N2O, and F gases, and other human forcings, consisting of aerosol radiation interaction, aerosol cloud interaction, black carbon on snow, contrails, ozone, stratospheric H2O, and land use. We are very on top of these specifics. So these gases cause warming. This is unanimously agreed upon and undeniable. So what about feedback mechanisms? Greater climate sensitivity implies more warming from increased greenhouse gases. Warming leads to negative feedbacks that mitigate warming and positive feedbacks that amplify warming. Negative feedbacks thus limit sensitivity, while positive feedbacks increase sensitivity. Reading from this chapter on climate sensitivity and feedback mechanisms, the relationship between the measure of forcing and the magnitude of the climate change response defines what is called the climate sensitivity. A process that changes the sensitivity of the climate response is called a feedback mechanism. The strength of a feedback can also be quantified and is termed positive if the process increases the magnitude of the response, and negative if the feedback reduces the magnitude of the response. For example, some types of clouds cause cooling by reflecting sunlight back into space. Warming can reduce the amount of these clouds, leading to less reflection and more warming, and thus positive feedback on warming. It's an example of a thing that is happening, causing the acceleration of that thing. You can also have negative feedback where you instead get a slowing down of that thing. In fact, some types of clouds actually cause warming by absorbing radiation that Earth emits. Reduction of these clouds via warming would lead to less absorption and less warming, and therefore negative feedback on warming. This paper talks about clouds in this precise context. Cloud feedback, a change of cloud fraction, has an effect on radiation, which is generally opposite in shortwave and longwave domains. On the one hand, a smaller cloud fraction increases the incoming solar radiation and thus warms the surface. On the other hand, it increases the outgoing longwave radiation and thus cools the surface. On average, models simulate, with a large spread, a decrease of the cloud radiative effect and an increase of incoming radiative flux due to the cloud response, lambda c greater than 0, when the surface temperature increases. Another important type of feedback is the Planck feedback. This is negative feedback that involves Earth radiating more energy into space as Earth warms. You've seen the Planck feedback at a smaller scale if you've used an infrared thermometer. The thermometer detects the increased radiation an object releases as it warms. Here is a paper describing this phenomenon. A warmer Earth emits more infrared radiation to space, which provides a strong negative feedback and helps to stabilize the Earth's climate, also known as the Planck feedback. If the Planck feedback was the only feedback, then doubling CO2 levels would cause about 1 degree Celsius of warming. Including other negative and positive feedbacks increases this to approximately 3 degrees of warming. Global warming has substantial impacts, as do other aspects of anthropogenic climate change. For instance, warming increases the volume of ocean water due to thermal expansion, and also melts land ice that eventually flows into the oceans. That causes sea level rise. Many scientists try to accurately communicate this information to the public. Here's a paper called Temperature-Driven Global Sea Level Variability in the Common Era. This is consistent with the observed GSL rise of 13.8 plus or minus 1.5 centimeters, which is due primarily to contributions from thermal expansion and glacier mass loss. Now let's bring Matt into the mix. Which of these evidence-based conclusions does he refuse to accept? Well, his stance, which is called Lukewarmism, actually does accept that human emission of CO2 likely caused most of the global warming since 1950. Reading from his blog, I am not claiming that carbon dioxide is not a greenhouse gas. It is. I am not saying that its concentration in the atmosphere is not increasing. It is. I am not saying the main cause of that increase is not the burning of fossil fuels. It is. I am not saying the climate does not change. It does. I am not saying that the atmosphere is not warmer today than it was 50 or 100 years ago. It is. And I am not saying that carbon dioxide emissions are not likely to have caused some, probably more than half, of the warming since 1950. I agree with the consensus on all these points. Hence the attitude espoused in his book, The Rational Optimist, described in this article. Ridley acknowledges that the greenhouse gas effect is real and humans have caused most of the warming over the past 50 years. I just don't think it will ever get dangerous, and if it does, by that time, we will have had plenty of time to adapt to it with new technologies. So he accepts some of the science and just pretends it's no big deal. But his lukewarmism states that the absence of strong positive feedback causes climate sensitivity to be low. Human greenhouse gas emissions therefore do not cause a large amount of warming. Dangerous AGW will never happen or will not occur in the 21st century, and conveniently, this undermines the case for rapid, forceful policy interventions. Back on his blog, there is a third possibility, that it's real, partly man-made, and not dangerous. This is the lukewarmer school, and I am happy to put myself in this category. Lukewarmers do not think dangerous climate change is impossible, but they think it is unlikely. The assumption is that modest warming from carbon dioxide must be trebly amplified by extra water vapor, that as the air warms there will be an increase in absolute humidity, providing a positive feedback. That assumption led to specific predictions that could be tested, and the tests come back negative again and again. The large positive feedback that can turn a mild warming into a dangerous one just is not there. There is no tropical troposphere hotspot. Ice cores unambiguously show that temperature can fall while carbon dioxide stays high. Estimates of climate sensitivity, which should be high if positive feedbacks are strong, are instead getting lower and lower. Above all, the temperature has failed to rise as predicted by the models. The agenda of this narrative is quite apparent in this article. If sensitivity is low and climate change continues at the same rate as it has over the past 50 years, then dangerous warming, usually defined as starting at 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, is about a century away. So we do not need to rush into subsidizing inefficient and land-hungry technologies such as wind and solar, or risk depriving poor people access to the beneficial effects of cheap electricity via fossil fuels. That's right, everything will be fine for a whole century, so stop doing wind and solar because those suck ass, and stop depriving poor people of electricity, a thing absolutely nobody is doing. Let's hear it from Matt.
So I don't think we're going to get runaway warming or dangerous warming, and I don't see any evidence that it's causing more extreme weather, which is basically what the facts show after 40 years. If you say that, you are a denier.
It's adorable when science deniers deny reality and then whine about being labeled science deniers. No evidence of more extreme weather, so all those bonus wildfires and droughts are totally imaginary, huh? Ridiculous. Lukewarmism is advocated by other prominent commentators, especially political conservatives, much like how Discovery Institute personnel accept some aspects of evolution in order to differentiate themselves from raving young earth creationist preachers. Some conservatives opt for lukewarmism to appear more credible than extreme denialists who refuse to accept there is any AGW whatsoever. Here are some books outlining this fallacious position. But lukewarmism is still a form of climate change denial. That it isn't the most extreme version of climate change denial doesn't change that. Old Earth creationism is still science denial, even if it's more reasonable than young Earth creationism. Matt supports lukewarmism by denying well-established scientific data and pushing conspiracy theories surrounding the following 5 things: warming mechanisms, the relative magnitude of warming and temperature, warming projections, the impacts of anthropogenic climate change, and science communication. We will now address each of these topics in turn, starting with warming mechanisms.
We know, for example, that for every extra bit of carbon dioxide you put in the air, you get a diminishing effect. The first bit has a big effect, the second bit has a smaller effect, and so on.
As you can see, Matt claims that each additional molecule of CO2 has a diminishing effect. Global warming should therefore slow down. This is echoed on his blog. 1/10 of the century now over and no significant warming yet. This should have been the fastest bit. Since the curve is logarithmic, the first 100 parts per million of CO2 should produce as much warming as the next 200 parts per million. Matt is right that there is a logarithmic relationship between CO2 increases and energy imbalance. Doubling CO2 levels from 300 ppm to 600 ppm has the same effect as doubling from 400 ppm to 800 ppm, but a 100 ppm increase from 300 ppm to 400 ppm causes more warming than a 100 ppm increase from 400 ppm to 500 ppm. On its own, this implies a diminishing effect. Here's a 2019 paper evaluating the performance of past climate model projections. In page 4 of the supporting information, we find the following equation. PCO2 represents the initial concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, while alpha CO2 represents the additional parts per million CO2 added. Forcing from increased CO2 is on the left side of the equation, and the fraction on the right side means the concentration of CO2 is increasing. The logarithm applied to that fraction is what's causing the diminishing effect, but CO2 is increasing at more than a linear rate, and humans increase greenhouse gases other than CO2. These are 2 facts Matt ignores when he claims warming should slow down. Here's the NOAA Annual Greenhouse Gas Index, or AGGI. In this figure, we clearly see the differentiation between carbon dioxide alone versus along with other greenhouse gases. Other factors, such as sulfate aerosol decrease, also contribute to the energy imbalance. These factors taken together mean the energy imbalance is not diminishing, despite the aforementioned logarithmic relationship. This very recent paper is titled Earth's Energy Imbalance More Than Doubled in Recent Decades. So warming from this energy imbalance is not slowing down, contrary to Matt's claim. AGW is not diminishing. Reading from this recent article, we have published a set of selected key indicators of global climate change via Climate Change Tracker, a platform which aims to provide reliable, user-friendly, high-quality interactive dashboards, visualizations, data, and easily accessible insights of this paper. Let's go ahead and check out Climate Change Tracker, shall we? We can confirm our assertion that AGW is not diminishing by checking the rate of temperature change on this tracker. It's rising faster than any time since industrialization. How does Matt get around these objective empirical facts? He just misrepresents how global warming is supposed to occur.
I have watched a perfectly reasonable hypothesis that carbon dioxide might cause runaway warming be tested and discussed and debated, and for 10 or 20 years you could argue both sides of it, and then gradually get closed down to the point where if you say something like, yeah, I think carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but I don't think there are positive feedback effects, and I think it's a diminishing effect, so I don't think we're going to get runaway warming or dangerous warming, and I don't see any evidence that it's causing more extreme weather, which is basically what the facts show after 40 years, if you say that, you are a denier.
He very deliberately uses misleading terms like runaway warming. Runaway warming is a straw man that conflates Earth with Venus. A Venus-style runaway involves so much positive feedback and so much warming that all liquid water boils. Nobody is saying that Earth is like Venus, and it doesn't have to be even remotely like Venus for global warming to be an enormous problem. A rise in average temperature of even a few degrees will be dangerous. Here's a paper called Positive Feedback in Climate, Stabilization or Runaway, illustrated by a simple experiment. Reading from the abstract, positive feedbacks can lead to instability. On Venus, for example, a positive feedback is thought to have evolved into a runaway greenhouse effect. However, positive feedbacks can exist in stable systems. See that? Positive feedback can evolve into a runaway greenhouse effect. They're not the same thing. There can be significant positive feedback and high climate sensitivity without such a runaway, with the Planck feedback eventually stopping the warming in the absence of an ongoing significant energy imbalance. We are nowhere near the energy imbalance needed for a runaway effect. The core point of a Venus-style runaway is irreversibility. Venus's runaway occurred in two stages, a moist phase and then a baked phase. In the moist phase, warming evaporates liquid water into water vapor. That water vapor acts as a greenhouse gas that contributes more warming, leading to more evaporation of water and more warming. This positive feedback goes so out of control that the oceans boil away. More of the water vapor can then break down and escape into space. Eventually, the planet becomes so hot that it enters the baked phase, in which CO2 escapes from the crust into the atmosphere. This is irreversible on Venus. The CO2 is stuck in the atmosphere, liquid water is gone, it's too hot for water vapor to condense, and much of the water vapor has been lost to space anyway. But human burning of fossil fuels would not cause Earth to reach the baked phase, since Earth's crust would take up CO2 from the atmosphere long before much of the liquid water evaporated. That atmospheric CO2 reduction would allow Earth to cool, allowing more water vapor to condense back into liquid. So humans can cause a huge amount of warming, but that warming is reversible. Even if we caused radiative forcing 5 times larger than what we've done so far, up to around 16 watts per square meter, we still would not reach Venus levels of pushing past the moist phase into the baked crust phase. It's nonsensical for Matt to think a runaway is relevant at anywhere near the levels of forcing we have caused so far. Looking at the paper Climate Sensitivity, Sea Level, and Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide, we can read this section beginning with, "Our simulations indicate that no plausible human-made GHG forcing can cause an instability and runaway greenhouse effect as defined by Ingersoll, in agreement with the theoretical analyses of Goldblatt and Watson." And the entire paragraph that follows expands on this in highly technical detail and in support of what we just discussed in contrasting Earth and Venus, so feel free to skim it if you like. But the important issue is whether positive feedbacks substantially increase sensitivity, not whether this feedback leads to runaway warming. Matt misrepresents that as well and just continues to pretend that positive feedback isn't an issue.
Most of the evidence on that is that the positive feedbacks are pretty small and diminishing. We know, for example, that for every extra bit of carbon dioxide you put in the air, you get a diminishing effect.
He just denies that there is large positive feedback, especially from water vapor. Back on his blog, he says this: "The assumption is that modest warming from carbon dioxide must be trebly amplified by extra water vapor, that as the air warms, there will be an increase in absolute humidity, providing a positive feedback. That assumption led to specific predictions that could be tested, and the tests come back negative again and again. The large positive feedback that can turn a mild warming into a dangerous one just is not there. This is false. Evidence instead shows warming evaporated water increasing water vapor levels because warmer air can hold more water vapor. This water vapor contributes more warming since water vapor is a greenhouse gas. There is significant positive feedback from water vapor, directly contradicting Matt's claim. This is not a Venus-style runaway unless you've noticed oceans boiling away the last time you went to the beach." Reading from Construction and Uncertainty Estimation of a Satellite-Derived Total Precipitable Water Data Record over the World's Oceans. The record clearly shows that the amount of vapor in the atmosphere has been increasing at a rate of about 1.5% per decade over the last 30 years as the planet warms. This is not surprising, since warmer air tends to hold more water vapor, but is a nice confirmation of estimates of temperature rise made by other instruments and methods. Then reading from another similar paper on trends in precipitable water vapor, or PWV. Upward global PWV trends are observed from 5 types of datasets in the period of 1979 to 2014 and become more apparent in recent years. Atmospheric water vapor provides the single largest positive feedback on global warming. Both climate models and observations suggest that an upward trend in water vapor is expected to appear as a response to the surface temperature increase. Let's hit one more paper on tropospheric water vapor feedback using satellite observations. The short-term water vapor feedback based on AIRS MLS observations from 2004 to 2016 is 1.55 plus or minus 0.23 watts per square meter per Kelvin. The long-term water vapor feedback inferred from observations is 1.85 plus or minus 0.32 watts per square meter per Kelvin. The science is quite clear here. If Matt gets information regarding warming mechanisms this wrong, what else is he fumbling?
They say it's 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels now, but pre-industrial levels did this, So which bit do you want to prove? I mean, we know that in the medieval period it was warmer than today because you find whole forests that are emerging from melting glaciers now. Well, they were forests in 1500 where there's no glacier, there would have been no glacier there now. So the glaciers come and then gone away again since.
So Matt argues that the medieval warm period was warmer than today, consistent with a graph he discusses in his document, A Lukewarmer's 10 Tests. Here, MWP refers to the medieval warm period, RWP to the Roman warm period, and CWP to the current warm period. In typical grifter fashion, this graph is doctored to remove recent warming, conveniently suiting his conclusion. That can be seen by comparing his graph to the original version, published in a 2010 paper by Fredrik Ljungqvist. Just take a look at Figure 3. This original graph covered less than half of the globe and excluded global warming from after 1999. Professor Ljungqvist later co-authored a 2019 global analysis that included global warming up to 2017. That analysis showed the medieval warm period was not warmer than today. Take a look at this figure. The sharp rise globally is unmistakable, so Matt relies on a doctored distortion of an expert's non-global analysis while disregarding the expert's more reliable global analysis. Oh, but it gets worse.
We're not in a period of unprecedented warmth. We're not in a period of unprecedentedly fast warmth. We're not in a period of increasing extreme weather. Floods, droughts, storms. There's no increase in their either frequency or severity.
The thing about frequency and severity of catastrophic events is hard to even process. Everybody knows that's wrong simply based on a vague awareness of these events from the news. But more subtly, Matt claims that neither modern temperature nor the modern warming rate are unprecedented for post-glacial periods. We can go progressively further back in time to see he's wrong. Checking his little pamphlet again, we now know there is nothing unprecedented about the level and rate of change of temperature today compared with medieval, Roman, Holocene optimum, and other post-glacial periods when carbon dioxide levels did not change significantly, but temperatures did. We already saw Ljungqvist's 2019 analysis contradicts Matt by showing modern warming and the modern warming rate are unprecedented for at least the past 2,000 years, so bringing up the medieval warm period and Roman warm period is just a total non-starter. Modern temperature is also likely unprecedented for at least the past 125,000 years. This was confirmed in a 2021 report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC. Reading from a 2022 paper looking at multi-century timescales, in 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that Northern Hemisphere temperatures had reached levels unprecedented in at least 1,400 years. The 2021 report now sees global mean temperatures rising to levels unprecedented in over 100,000 years. This technical note briefly explains the reasons behind this major change. Namely, the new assessment reflects additional global warming that occurred between the two reports and improved paleotemperature reconstructions that extend further back in time. So the modern warming rate is unusually large compared to warming coming out of the glacial phase of the last ice age. This means the warming rate is unprecedented for at least the past 24,000 years. There go Matt's claims on the Holocene climate optimum and other post-glacial time periods. He makes it even worse by again relying on a fabricated analysis. First, check out this Nature article from 2021. The LGMR, Last Glacial Maximum Reanalysis, underscores the dramatic nature of anthropogenic warming, whose magnitude and rate appear unusual in the context of the past 24 kiloyears. Matt cites an analysis of one location in Greenland to argue that the Holocene climate optimum of approximately 7,000 years ago was globally warmer than the modern period. From his blog, you will have seen this graph, one of many now making it amply clear that the warmth of the Holocene optimum, peaking about 7,000 years ago, was both global in extent and considerably warmer than today. This data ends by 95 years before the present, where present means 1950. The Greenland data thus ends by 1855, yet Matt misrepresents it as encompassing modern global warming. People have noticed this misrepresentation. Check out Carbon Brief's fact check. First, the x-axis is mislabeled. In fact, it should say years before 1950 rather than years before present 2000 AD. The GISP2 ice core only extends up to 1855, 95 years before 1950. This can be confirmed on the NOAA website. The time period coverage is from 49,981 to 95 in calendar years before present BP. BP, by convention, refers to number of years before 1950. This slightly confusing convention is popularly used in archaeology, though not familiar to laypeople and thus easy to distort. This is all confirmed on the data's website. Look at this part here, top depth before 1950 CE. Not today, 75 years ago. The non-global analysis Matt shows is doctored to distort its time frame. Richard Alley criticizes denialists for distorting his work regarding these ice cores. So using GISP2 data to argue against global warming is, well, stupid or misguided or misled or something, but surely not scientifically sensible. Now let's move from Matt's misinformation about past climate to his misinformation about projections of future climate.
Well, the average temperature of the planet does seem to be going steadily upwards.
Since when?
Since the mid-80s.
So
It went down in the 70s.
I remember all the fears about the ice age
Yes,
coming.
in the 70s.
So we were told the planet is about to freeze in the 70s.
Yeah, it was very, and that wasn't a fringe view, by the way. It was, covers of Time and Newsweek and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, people have forgotten that.
Yeah, and it was going to be 6 degrees of cooling, and it was going to be amazing changes, and that didn't happen. It bottomed out and started warming gently.
So Matt notes that before global warming steadily increased in the 1980s, 1970s media promoted projections of global cooling leading to an ice age. Well, the time cover being referenced is a hoax. It never happened. But apart from this, the press was a mix of warming and cooling projections, not just cooling. We also have to point out that claims made in popular media are not a replacement for scientists' projections in the peer-reviewed literature. Reading from 2008 paper, The Myth of the 1970s Global Cooling Scientific Consensus. For example, the following are titles from 2 New York Times articles. Scientists ask why world climate is changing, major cooling may be ahead. And warming trend seen in climate, 2 articles counter view that cold period is due. Scientists' warming projections outnumbered cooling projections. The warming projections played a more prominent role in the field, as is reflected by more citations. The survey identified only 7 articles indicating cooling, compared to 44 indicating warming. Those 7 cooling articles garnered just 12% of the citations. Scientists projected warming because they expected the impact of greenhouse gas increases to overwhelm the cooling effect of aerosols. By 1978, the question of the relative role of aerosol cooling and greenhouse warming had been sorted out. Greenhouse warming, the researchers concluded, had become the dominant forcing. This was borne out as illustrated by a 2019 analysis. Greenhouse gas increases contributed a warming effect since at least the early 20th century, not just since the mid-1980s, as shown by the red line. That warming effect was partially offset by cooling from sulfate aerosol emissions, shown by the dark blue line. But since the 1970s, greenhouse gas increases dominated the multi-decadal temperature trend and energy imbalance, greatly outpacing contributions from factors such as changes in solar output and volcanic emissions in light blue. We have plenty of data identifying the contribution to climate change by each individual component. Greenhouse gases take the cake. 1970s peer-reviewed projections accurately projected the amount of warming caused by this energy imbalance. Subsequent warming projections built on this success, once again referencing some work evaluating past climate model projections. Model simulations published between 1970 and 2007 were skillful in projecting future global mean surface warming. Even scientists working for the fossil fuel industry dismissed claims of global cooling and instead projected dangerous anthropogenic warming. That did not stop the fossil fuel industry from misleading the public in places like editorial-style advertisements or advertorials. Matt continues that tradition of deceiving the public. To quote a 2023 science paper, ExxonMobil scientists correctly dismissed the possibility of a coming ice age in favor of a carbon dioxide-induced super-interglacial, accurately predicted that human-caused global warming would first be detectable in the year 2000 plus or minus 5, and reasonably estimated how much CO2 would lead to dangerous warming. And in another paper, ExxonMobil contributed to advancing climate science by way of its scientists' academic publications, but promoted doubt about it in advertorials. Given this discrepancy, we conclude that ExxonMobil misled the public. Modern warming projections thus have a much stronger basis than 1970s claims of cooling. It is inappropriate for Matt to compare 1970s cooling projections to more modern science on AGW. Not content with distorting 1970s projections, Matt also misrepresents more modern warming projections. For example, in a 2014 Wall Street Journal article, Matt argues that a 2013 IPCC projection overestimated warming. As a lukewarmer, he instead predicts no more than 0.4 degrees Celsius of warming for the 30 years following 1995, so less than 0.15 degrees Celsius per decade. Reading from his blog, last September, between the second and final draft of its fifth assessment report, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change quietly downgraded the warming it expected in the 30 years following 1995 to about 0.5 degrees Celsius from 0.7, or in Fahrenheit to about 0.9 degrees from 1.3. Even that is likely to be too high. But his article's title, Whatever Happened to Global Warming, and its claims about a supposed 15-year hiatus in warming are pretty ironic given what Matt admits about a decade later.
And since then, it's warmed at, about a quarter of a degree per decade on average across the last 30, 40 years.
So in 2025, Matt correctly admits to approximately a quarter of a degree per decade of warming for the past 30 or 40 years, going back to 1985 or 1995. That exceeds his lukewarmist prediction by around a factor of 2. Check out this image updated all the way to this year. This is corroborated by a multitude of official sources to high degrees of precision. The increase for the last 30 years, from 1995 to 2024, is 0.26 plus or minus 0.05 degrees Celsius per decade. This corroborates the higher rate of change in recent years that we highlighted earlier. When making his prediction, Matt also misrepresents the IPCC's 2013 projection. The IPCC projection encompassed the range of 0.3 degrees Celsius to 0.7 degrees Celsius, not just 0.5 degrees Celsius, and the projection's time frame was from a baseline of 1986 to 2005 to a baseline of 2016 to 2035, not just 1995 to 30 years later. Reading from a 2018 IPCC report, Overall, in the absence of major volcanic eruptions, which would cause significant but temporary cooling, and assuming no significant future long-term changes in solar irradiance, it is likely, greater than 66% probability, that the GMST anomaly for the period 2016 to 2035, relative to the reference period of 1986 to 2005, will be in the range 0.3 degrees Celsius to 0.7 degrees Celsius, expert assessment to one significant figure, medium confidence. Along with his misrepresentation of a more recent IPCC projection, Matt distorts their 1990 projection as well. He repeatedly suggests that projection overestimates warming, like he does in this tweet. I, for one, never argued there was no warming or it was all natural. I've argued that it is happening slower than the 1900 IPCC prediction of 0.3 C plus or minus 0.2 C for 1900, read 1990. He does this on his blog too, having seen it occur slower than was predicted in the first IPCC report in 1990. In actuality, the 1990 IPCC report projected 4 different scenarios for human emission of greenhouse gases, including CO2, CH4, N2O, and CFCs. Yes, the same CFCs that were once breaking down the ozone layer. Scenario A, also called BAU for business as usual, is just what it sounds like. We keep emitting greenhouse gases as usual without a care in the world. Scenarios B, C, and D had progressively greater reductions in our emissions. Those 4 emissions scenarios then led to 4 different scenarios for atmospheric greenhouse gas increases and for the energy imbalance, or forcing, caused by those increases. Finally, there were 4 scenarios for the warming caused by that energy imbalance, with projected warming accelerating over time for scenario BAU while decelerating for the other scenarios. Here is the full 400-page report. Now back to figure A3. The IPCC projected 4 warming scenarios as we noted previously. Matt cherry-picks scenario BAU without mentioning the other 3. But we did not follow a business-as-usual emissions scenario. For example, the Soviet Union fell apart, limiting CH4 emissions, and political agreements on ozone-depleting substances, or ODSs, led to less CFC emissions, as outlined in 2019's large greenhouse gas savings due to changes in the post-Soviet food systems. Then, reading from 2007 paper, The Importance of the Montreal Protocol in Protecting Climate. ODSs and their substitute fluorocarbon gases are also greenhouse gases, which contribute to the radiative forcing, RF, of climate. Thus, actions under the Montreal Protocol to phase out ODSs and/or increase the use of substitute gases have consequences for climate forcing. So post-1990 forcing is lower than scenario BAU and more closely follows scenario B. Look at figure 5b in this paper, which shows the observed energy imbalance. Warming follows scenario B more closely than scenario A, consistent with the about 0.25 degrees Celsius per decade warming trend Matt admits to. However, there is no evidence that observed warming is decelerating in the way that scenario B decelerates later in this century. Here is further analysis of IPCC 1990 scenarios A and B through 2019, compared to a 1972 projection from climate scientist Mikhail Budyko, then a 2013 paper in Nature Climate Change assessing this 1990s consensus. Scenario B gives a best estimate of about 0.37 degrees Celsius for 1990 to 2010, with a range of about 0.16 to 0.63 degrees Celsius, accounting for climate sensitivity uncertainty and interval variability using the most restrictive interpretation discussed above, which very closely matches the observed trend. And included an estimate of climate change as a predicted rise from 1990 to 2030 of 0.7 to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with a best estimate of 1.1 degrees Celsius. Observed warming is even within the uncertainty range for scenario BAU, stated as 0.2 degrees Celsius to 0.5 degrees Celsius per decade for 1990 to 2100, and 0.7 to 1.5 degrees Celsius with a best estimate of 1.1 degrees Celsius for 1990 to 2030. Since scenario BAU's projected warming accelerates with time, it's better to compare observed warming to scenario BAU's 1990 to 2030 projection instead of its 1990 to 2100 projection. Going back to the full report, a rate of increase of global mean temperature during the next century of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade, with an uncertainty range of 0.2 degrees Celsius to 0.5 degrees Celsius per decade. This will result in a likely increase in global mean temperature of about 1 degree Celsius above the present value by 2025. And 0.7 to 1.5 degrees Celsius with a best estimate of 1.1 degrees Celsius. Given Matt's stated warming trend of 0.25 degrees Celsius per decade, we are on pace for about 1 degree of warming for 1990 to 2030. That's near the middle of the 0.7 to 1.5 degrees Celsius range for scenario BAU, and almost matches scenario BAU's best estimate of 1.1 degrees Celsius. For 1990 to 2025, Matt's trend implies around 0.9 degrees Celsius, almost matching scenario BAU's best estimate of 1 degree Celsius, and within the scenario's uncertainty range. So even if Matt continues willfully ignoring scenario B, he was still wrong to claim warming was below the uncertainty range for the scenario BAU he cherry picks. Subsequent research also confirms that the 1990 IPCC First Assessment Report, or FAR, accurately represented how much warming is caused by an energy imbalance. The IPCC warming projections would instead overestimate this ratio of warming versus energy imbalance if the IPCC overestimated climate sensitivity. The IPCC notes this in their 2021 assessment of scenario BAU's best estimate of warming, excluding BAU's uncertainty range surrounding that best estimate. Similarly, while FAR projected a higher rate of global surface temperature warming than has been observed, this is largely because it overestimated future GHG concentrations. FAR's projected increase in total anthropogenic forcing between 1990 and 2017 was 1.6 watts per square meter, while the observational estimate of actual forcing during that period is 1.1 watts per square meter. Under these actual forcings, the change in temperature in FAR aligns with observations. Despite the IPCC's success, Matt insists his warming predictions are more accurate than those of the IPCC. Reading from What's Up With That, the scientific consensus has settled down on about a degree of temperature increase over a century, but Lambert seemed to be under the impression that it was obvious that I was already wrong. In a series of tweets and in a very odd cherry-picked graph with no data source cited, he kept insisting that there's been 0.4 degrees of warming between 1993 and 2013. He states this about his 1993 prediction of about 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade of warming, while deriding the claim of 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade of post-1993 warming. But at least 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade of post-1993 warming has occurred, consistent with the 30 or 40-year warming trend Matt acknowledges. Looking at this NOAA chart, we have about 0.8 of a degree of warming from 1993 to now. He further mocks the idea of hitting 3 degrees Celsius of warming in the 21st century on his blog. The climate is going to have to get a move on if it is hit 3C this century, 1/10 of the century now over and no significant warming yet. But again, 21st century warming so far is about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade, rounded to 1 decimal point. Matt is just lying. You might think that Matt underestimating AGW means that he also underestimates AGW's impact, and you'd be right.
The acceleration of sea level rise, that's another possible threat. After 40, 50 years, we can be much more relaxed about them than we were.
And another audio-only source.
Sea level is rising, but at the very unthreatening rate of about a foot per century, and it actually seems to be decelerating.
So Matt claims sea level rise is not accelerating. He even claims it decelerated. He mentions this in this article as well. The sea level is rising, as it did throughout the 20th century, but not at an accelerating rate. The best guess is that it is rising at about 3.2 millimeters a year, or about a foot per century. And let's check out a tweet for good measure. And you mean the unsteady rise in sea level decelerating since 2004? In reality, sea level rise accelerated in conjunction with global warming, now approaching at least 4.5 millimeters per year. That exceeds Matt's estimate of 3.2 millimeters per year. Here's a 2024 paper in Nature Communications, Earth and Environment on the subject. In addition, the rate of global mean sea level rise over those 3 decades has increased from around 2.1 millimeters per year in 1993 to around 4.5 millimeters per year in 2023. Then we check the World Meteorological Organization's 2024 report on the state of the global climate. The long-term rate of sea level rise has more than doubled since the start of the satellite record, increasing from 2.1 millimeters per year between 1993 and 2002 to 4.7 millimeters per year between 2015 and 2024. Surprise, surprise, Matt is just lying. Now let's watch him lie about global greening.
But at the same time, the carbon dioxide we're putting in the air is having a very measurable effect that's beneficial. And we refuse to take that into account. And that is global greening. There is more green vegetation on the planet now compared with the 1980s, equivalent to a continent the size of North America that's been added of green vegetation. That's an enormous impact.
All right, let's dig into this now. Matt focuses on the benefits of CO2 for photosynthesis and plant growth, also known as CO2 fertilization. That would lead to global greening, in which more of the globe is covered by plants. In 2022, Matt stated that all studies show Earth is greening, predominantly due to increasing CO2. He supports this in a Spiked article by citing a 2016 NASA page that discusses a 2016 study. Although tree planting, natural reforestation, slightly longer growing seasons, and a bit more rain all contribute, the big cause is something else. All studies agree that by far the largest contributor to global greening, responsible for roughly half the effect, is the extra carbon dioxide in the air. All studies? Which studies would those be? This hyperlink goes to that NASA page, but that page does not purport to discuss all studies, instead focusing on one 2016 study. Reading from the NASA page, results showed that carbon dioxide fertilization explains 70% of the greening effect, said co-author Ranga Maineni, a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. Okay, so let's go to that paper in Nature Climate Change, Greening of the Earth and its Drivers. Factorial simulations with multiple global ecosystem models suggest that CO2 fertilization effects explain 70% of the observed greening trend. A later 2019 NASA page instead emphasizes the contribution of land use changes, such as increased tree planting. That NASA page is about a 2019 study that goes into further detail about the role of land use changes versus increased CO2. This study notes that CO2's impact on climate change can indirectly harm plants, even if plants use CO2 for photosynthesis. Reading from that page, the effect stems mainly from ambitious tree planting programs in China and intensive agriculture in both countries. This long-term data lets us dig deeper, said Rama Nemani, a research scientist at NASA's Ames Research Center in California's Silicon Valley and a co-author of the new work. When the greening of the Earth was first observed, we thought it was due to a warmer, wetter climate and fertilization from the added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, leading to more leaf growth in northern forests, for instance. Now, with the MODIS data that lets us understand the phenomenon at really small scales, we see that humans are also contributing. Now, reading from the 2019 paper, China and India lead in greening of the world through land use management. Human land use is a dominant driver of greening Earth. The above results provide at least 4 arguments in favor of a greater role for the direct driver than previously thought. Cropland greening is mainly attributable to the direct driver, without discounting the minor but opposing contributions of the indirect drivers. CO2 fertilization has been reported to increase crop production, while climate change has been reported to increase or decrease in crop yields depending on location. Matt was explicitly told that the 2019 study shared many of the same authors as the 2016 study he relied on, and that the 2019 study likely updates the conclusions of the 2016 study. It's a similar author team here. In Zhu et al. 2016, they estimated 4% due to direct land use change. Here they find it accounts for over a third. Funny how Matt doesn't update his script with this new information. Another 2018 study points to a larger role for land use changes in global greening than for increased CO2. Recently, using ecosystem models, Zhu et al. 2016 attributed 70% of observed global LAI increase to the CO2 fertilization effect, and 4% to land use change. Our finding that global bare ground cover has decreased over the past 35 years suggests a net increase in vegetation cover and thus agrees with the greening trend. However, our results differ from previous studies by quantifying the prominent role of land use in global vegetation change. Using a global probability-based sample, we attribute 60% of observed land changes to land use activities. So as you can see, this study even argues against the conclusion of the 2016 study Matt promotes. His 2022 comments mention neither of these studies, despite both having been available to him and specifically brought to his attention on social media. Matt simply exaggerates CO2's contribution to greening by making a strong claim about what all studies show without sufficiently checking the literature. It's not what all studies show at all. It's a distortion of what one study showed. The evidence on global greening is not as clear as Matt presents. For instance, research from 2022 showed greening reversed around 2000 due largely to a warming climate. So Matt's focus on CO2 fertilization downplays the harm from CO2-induced warming, and the benefit from fertilization may be weakening. To quote that 2022 paper that estimated greening using a leaf area index, or LAI, "The leveling off of global greenness arisen from recent exceeding optimal temperature and increasing water limitation for photosynthesis. Experimental evidence of the saturation of CO2 fertilization effect on vegetation photosynthesis, together with the global decline of CO2 fertilization effects on vegetation photosynthesis from this century." A 2019 paper showed a similar stalling or reversal of greening. The vegetation greening trend indicated by a satellite-derived vegetation index, GIMMS3G, which was evident before the late 1990s, was subsequently stalled or reversed. Matt broadens his argument beyond global greening and sea level rise acceleration to discuss the overall impact of anthropogenic climate change. To do this, he claims the IPCC's range for climate sensitivity did not narrow, and that this range includes his low sensitivity estimate. The IPCC's range would thus include scenarios in which there is not much risk from AGW, reading from his blog. The IPCC actually admits the possibility of lukewarming within its consensus because it gives a range of possible future temperatures. It thinks the world will be between about 1.5 and 4 degrees warmer on average by the end of the century. That's a huge range from marginally beneficial to terrifyingly harmful, so it is hardly a consensus of danger, and if you look at the probability density functions of climate sensitivity, they always cluster towards the lower end. Of course, this is echoed in his tweets. This is the key point. 45 years of research has failed to narrow the range of this estimate, meaning that climate change could be anything from very mild to very severe. Is it really precautionary to risk the economy? Contrary to Matt's claim, the IPCC's sensitivity range narrowed between their 2013 Fifth Assessment Report and their 2021 Sixth Assessment Report, or AR5 and AR6. This range for equilibrium climate sensitivity, or ECS, went from 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius to 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius. The AR5 assessed ECS to have a likely range from 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius based on the majority of studies and evidence available at the time, the broader evidence base presented in this report, and the general agreement among different lines of evidence means that they can be combined to yield a narrower range of ECS values. In summary, based on multiple lines of evidence, the best estimate of ECS is 3 degrees Celsius. It is likely within the range 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius and very likely within the range 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. Matt evades this point by simply ignoring the 2021 report, even though it had been available to him for years when he made his 2024 tweet. He also incorrectly calculates sensitivity. For example, he assumes all the warming from increased CO2 happens rapidly. Since the modal climate sensitivity in all the best studies is now settling down at a bit over 1.5 degrees C. Then check out his ridiculous 2011 pamphlet, Scientific Heresy. First of all, the title is a massive tell. Science deniers always use this trope of comparing scientific consensus to religious dogma because it's the only way to elevate their lies over facts. Scientific consensus can't possibly be as it is because of mountains of empirical data. Heavens no. It has to be stupid Bible stuff because reasons. It's the oldest trick in the book, and anyone who does it should be immediately discounted. Anyway, reading from this thing now. The sensitivity of the climate could be a harmless 1.2 degrees Celsius, half of which has already been experienced, or it could be less if feedbacks are negative, or it could be more if feedbacks are positive. What does the empirical evidence say? Since 1960, we have had roughly 1/3 of a doubling, so we must have had almost half of the greenhouse warming expected from a doubling. That's elementary arithmetic, given that the curve is agreed to be logarithmic. Yet, if you believe the surface thermometers, the red and green lines, we have had about 0.6 degrees Celsius of warming in that time, at the rate of less than 0.13 degrees Celsius per decade, somewhat less if you believe the satellite thermometers, the blue and purple lines, so we are on track for 1.2 degrees Celsius. Well, he is objectively wrong since some of the warming takes longer to occur. For example, if climate sensitivity is 3 degrees Celsius per doubling of CO2, then only about 2 degrees Celsius of warming will occur by the time CO2 doubles. This reflects thermal inertia, or resistance of the climate system to increase its temperature. So future generations will have to deal with additional warming caused by our current emissions. Still, let's apply Matt's incorrect method to see what it implies. The value of the parameter delta Ts, increase in mean global air temperature upon a doubling of the CO2 concentration in the calculation above, is proposed as lying between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. The average of these values is 3 degrees Celsius. It is clear, however, that in estimates of current near-term climate change, this value should be reduced somewhat because of the thermal inertia of the climate system on an increase in temperature. For this reason, according to most authors, delta Ts should be reduced by 20 to 40% of its original value. By utilizing here the mean of this correction factor, 30%, the increase in mean temperature by the year 2030 is 2.1 degrees Celsius. Since 1960, there has been at least 1.2 degrees Celsius of global surface warming, and of the lower atmosphere, which Matt mentions with satellite thermometers. See the median value in the third column of this image. There was also about a 34% increase in CO2, from around 317 parts per million to around 425 parts per million. That causes an energy imbalance of 1.57 watts per square meter. Recalling this 2019 paper, from page 4 of the supporting information, we see the following equation. PCO2 represents the initial concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, while alpha CO2 represents the additional parts per million CO2 added. Plugging in values without units, forcing equals 5.35 times the natural log of 425 over 317 equals 5.35 times the natural log of 1.34 equals 1.57. With units, forcing equals 1.57 watts per square meter. A doubling of CO2 would cause an imbalance of 3.7 watts per square meter, so at least 1.2 degrees Celsius for 1.57 watts per square meter implies 2.8 degrees Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2. Applying Matt's method thus implies climate sensitivity of at least 2.8 degrees Celsius, around twice the value he gave. This makes his position self-refuting. His sensitivity estimates of 1.2 degrees Celsius and a bit over 1.5 degrees C are also lower than the IPCC's range of 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius. So his lukewarmism is not within the IPCC's range, despite what he claims. When it comes to climate risk under different estimates of climate sensitivity, the IPCC shows the following in its most recent 2021 assessment. To briefly summarize, the black and white figure answers the question, how much warming would result from doubling CO2 levels, or how sensitive is the climate to greenhouse gas increases. The colored graphs answer the question, how much risk is there over time for a given sensitivity value and emissions scenario. The graphs show risk increases with greater climate sensitivity and greater emissions, with moderate and high risk even at lower sensitivity. Now getting into more detail, back to the graph on the left, there is a y-axis representing the numerical value for climate sensitivity, and an x-axis representing the likelihood that the y-axis number is the correct value for climate sensitivity. The most likely sensitivity value is thus around 3 degrees Celsius. AR6 refers to the IPCC's 2021 Sixth Assessment Report, so these likelihoods represent the IPCC's position in that report. The graphs on the right correspond to the climate sensitivity estimates from the black and white graph. For example, the top two graphs are for the topmost gray shaded region in the black and white graph, corresponding to climate sensitivity of 5 degrees Celsius or more. The SSP labels between the colored graphs represent different emissions scenarios. The larger the number at the end of the label, the more greenhouse gas emissions released, and the more forcing that results from those emissions. So SSP 5 to 8.5 has the most emissions, and SSP 1 to 1.9 has the least. The colors tell you the risk for each year based on the color key on the far right. For instance, there's a lot of purple in the top right portion of the mid-range ECS graph for risk to unique and threatened systems. That means that at mid-range climate sensitivity values of 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius, there is very high risk to unique and threatened systems under high emission scenarios by around 2065 and onwards. The IPCC thus notes the substantial risk implied by its sensitivity range. These points were available to Matt when he made his 2024 tweet to the contrary, but he leaves out this information and instead promotes misinformation. That leaves us with arguably the central pillar of Matt's lukewarmism, whether or not warming is dangerous.
So I don't think we're going to get runaway warming or dangerous warming.
Matt acknowledges 2 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels is dangerous, but he claims dangerous warming will not occur in the 21st century. I just don't think it will ever get dangerous, and if it does, by that time, we will have had plenty of time to adapt to it with new technologies. We're adapting now, giving up on prevention and reversal entirely. Anyway, on his blog, he says his grandchildren likely will not experience dangerous warming. Now 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels is the threshold at which warming starts to turn dangerous, according to the scientific consensus. That is to say, in 3 of the 4 scenarios considered by the IPCC, by the time my children's children are elderly, the Earth will still not have experienced any harmful warming, let alone catastrophe. But then he also acknowledges...
And since then, it's warmed at, about 1/4 of a degree per decade on average across the last 30, 40 years, and it's they say it's 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels now.
Well, at that rate, we should reach dangerous warming of 2 degrees Celsius by 2045 to 2050. So not only would Matt's grandchildren live to experience dangerous warming, but he could live to see it too, the 67-year-old privileged Viscount that he is. His statements in 2025 imply as much. But then how did Matt claim in 2015 that dangerous warming would not ever occur, or at least would not happen in the 21st century? How does he square his 2015 claims with his 2025 admission? If sensitivity is low and climate change continues at the same rate as it has over the past 50 years, then dangerous warming, usually defined as starting at 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, is about a century away. To do this, he commits at least 3 distortions. First, he never simultaneously admits that 2 degrees Celsius is coming by mid-century and that 2 degrees Celsius is dangerous. He will imply the former claim now and explicitly state the latter before 2016, but never both in the same setting at the same time. Otherwise, his audience would conclude that dangerous warming is on the horizon, and thus his lukewarmism is wrong. Second, he makes predictions that underestimate warming, as previously shown. Third, despite 2 degrees Celsius being calculated from a pre-industrial baseline of 1850 to 1900, Matt sometimes incorrectly calculates 2 degrees Celsius from a baseline in 2012. That's why, for instance, Matt claims only 1 out of 4 IPCC scenarios imply dangerous warming in the 21st century. Reading from a World Meteorological Organization document, annual average global temperature was 1.45 plus or minus 0.12 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, 1850 to 1900, in 2023. There's 1850 to 1900 as the pre-industrial baseline, and reading from the IPCC full report on this baseline, unless otherwise specified, warming is expressed relative to the period 1850 to 1900, used as an approximation of pre-industrial temperatures in AR5. Any thoughts, Matt?
That's the only one of their 4 scenarios that produces dangerous warming at the end of this century, because 2 degrees warming is the threshold at which everybody agrees that the problem is dangerous. And 3.5 degrees is produced by that scenario with those assumptions. But if you lower the sensitivity assumption to what the observational studies suggest, then even that scenario doesn't produce dangerous climate change. Or rather, it does by 0.1 degree.
Okay, so what's this table all about? The first column lists greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. The larger the number at the end, the more greenhouse gas emissions humans released, and the more forcing that results from those emissions. So RCP 8.5 has the most emissions, and RCP 2.6 has the least. The next 4 columns state the projected amount of global warming from a given date range up to 2081 to 2100, under a given set of assumptions. For instance, CMIP5 models for the second and third columns means these columns are projections from climate models used by the IPCC. The 1850 to 1900 means this is projected warming from the average temperature for the years 1850 to 1900 up to the average temperature for the years 2081 to 2100. So the 1.6 in the second column means that under the RCP 2.6 emission scenario, 1.6 degrees of global warming is projected by 2081 to 2100 relative to 1850 to 1900. The TCR of 1.35 degrees Celsius for the fourth and fifth columns means projections in these columns use a climate sensitivity lower than that of the CMIP5 models. Hence why warming in the fourth column is less than in the second column, and warming in the fifth column is less than in the third column. The fourth and fifth columns are largely irrelevant since they're not part of the IPCC assessment that Matt is supposed to be discussing. They're from another climate change denier named Nicholas Lewis, who, like Matt, inaccurately minimized threats such as AGW and COVID-19. Columns 1, 2, and 3 are the IPCC's model-based position. Now let's apply this to Matt's statements in the video. The 2 degrees warming is the threshold he talks about should be relative to pre-industrial levels, or relative to 1850 to 1900. He should thus be checking the second column. But he circles the third column, which is for warming relative to 2012, not relative to pre-industrial levels. That leads him to the incorrect conclusion that only scenario RCP 8.5 gets to dangerous warming of 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, seemingly disregarding RCP 6, also reaching 2 degrees Celsius in column 3. If he instead looked at the correct column, the second column, then he'd see that 3 out of 4 of the scenarios reach 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The only scenario that does not quite get there is RCP 2.6, the very stringent scenario in which we rapidly curtail use of fossil fuels, especially coal, and shift towards renewable energy. You know, the scenario Matt voraciously campaigns against for obvious reasons. So it's 3 out of 4 scenarios that imply dangerous warming, Matt, not 1. 3 out of 4, and the scenario that avoids dangerous warming is the scenario you actively oppose due to a financial agenda. Going back to the IPCC report, check out this figure. This figure shows global warming projections from CMIP5 models. It's basically a more detailed version of the first, second, and third columns from the chart Matt showed in his crappy talk full of lies. The dark lines are the relative temperature above a given baseline value, and the colored shading is the uncertainty range. The black line is modeling of observed temperature in the past. The colored lines are modeled projections for the future under different emissions scenarios labeled on the top left of the graph. For example, the dark red line is the projected warming under RCP 8.5, and the red shading is the uncertainty range for that warming projection. You can then use the y-axis to tell you when dangerous warming of 2 degrees Celsius occurs under each emission scenario. The average for 1850 to 1900 is around negative 0.8 degrees Celsius, so that's our pre-industrial baseline for the projection, and we reach dangerous warming of 2 degrees Celsius above that baseline when we cross about 1.2 degrees Celsius on the y-axis. RCP 8.5 crosses that threshold by around 2040, RCP 4.5 by approximately 2050, and RCP 6 by around 2060. Again, that's 3 out of 4 scenarios resulting in dangerous warming this century, not Matt's claim of only one scenario. Dangerous warming would therefore come several decades earlier than Matt claimed. The IPCC noted this. Relative to the average from year 1850 to 1900, warming is likely to exceed 2 degrees Celsius for RCP 6 and RCP 8.5 high confidence, more likely than not to exceed 2 degrees Celsius for RCP 4.5 high confidence, but unlikely to exceed 2 degrees Celsius for RCP 2.6 medium confidence. Matt later realized his distortion and tried to fix it by adding parenthetical remarks, but fixing his misrepresentation debunks his original conclusion that dangerous warming will not occur in the 21st century. In the Financial Post, he says, 3 of the models show a moderate, slow, and mild warming, the hottest of which leaves the planet just 2 degrees centigrade warmer than today in 2081 to 2100. The coolest comes out just 0.8 degrees warmer. Now, 2 degrees is the threshold at which warming starts to turn dangerous, according to the scientific consensus. This is known as RCP 8.5, and it produces 3.5 degrees of warming in 2081 to 2100. That's the mistake he made when he placed his red circle on the 3rd column in the video. Instead of calculating warming from the pre-industrial level of 1850 to 1900, he's calculating it from today, meaning 2012. That's why in the Financial Post he writes 3.5 degrees of warming for RCP 8.5 and 2 degrees centigrade warmer than today for RCP 6. Later, on his blog, he realized that 2 degrees Celsius of dangerous warming is not calculated from today, so he rewrites the warming trends to be from the pre-industrial level of 1850 to 1900. Now 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels is the threshold at which warming starts to turn dangerous, according to the scientific consensus. This is known as RCP 8.5, and it produces 3.5 degrees of warming in 2081 to 2100, or 4.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. You can tell he's moved to a baseline of 1850 to 1900 since his 4.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels matches the RCP 8.5 value from the 2nd column of his video's table. But if he's moved to a baseline of 1850 to 1900, then he needs to rewrite this as well. That is to say, in 3 of the 4 scenarios considered by the IPCC, by the time my children's children are elderly, the Earth will still not have experienced any harmful warming, let alone catastrophe. After all, if he's using 1850 to 1900 as a baseline, then 3 out of 4 of the scenarios project dangerous warming of 2 degrees Celsius before his grandkids are elderly. Yet Matt leaves that part exactly the same in his blog. So he refuses to acknowledge that his toddler mistake completely falsifies his conclusion on dangerous warming. So he's lying. He's lying right to the faces of his ultra-rich grandchildren and to all of us. Instead of acknowledging his errors, he just plays word games with terms like crisis.
The very study that got to 97% of scientists think climate change is happening said they think it's happening. Well, I'm in the 97%. They didn't say they thought it was a crisis. Do you see what I mean? You cannot find any study that says 97% of scientists think it's a crisis.
So what's
literally? You could probably get to 50 or 40 or 60.
This is just false. There are plenty of surveys showing a far greater than 60% consensus on both humans driving current climate change and on climate change being a dangerous threat to humanity or a serious problem. It's just semantics whether one uses the word crisis or not. If you only count scientists that use specific words you choose and that imply the meaning you designate to it, you can skew the results of these surveys as much as you want. The implications of these surveys are clear. There is literature discussing the problem with vague language and how denialists deliberately distort it. Another claim advanced by those who reject the mainstream scientific agreement on climate is that the consensus position consists of a claim of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, or the frequently used acronym CAGW. However, CAGW is rarely, if ever, defined or sourced to a mainstream scientific organization or study. Any scientific study's result or statement by a researcher that does not fit a contrarian's personal flexible definition of CAGW can therefore be adopted as ostensibly supporting their view and refuting the mainstream, even when such results are actually consistent with the mainstream position on climate. So, unsurprisingly, Matt has now moved the goalposts to claiming 2 degrees Celsius of warming is not catastrophic, dangerous, or whatever other term contradicting his previous claims.
So it's simply not true to say that 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming above this so-called pre-industrial level, which is a myth anyway. There was no level temperature before industry. It's simply not true to say that degree of warming is catastrophic.
This makes Matt look incredibly dishonest. He conveys a standard of evidence for accepting a conclusion on dangerous AGW, 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But when that standard is met, he simply changes the standard instead of accepting reality on dangerous AGW. His evasion confirms he is a denialist, unpersuadable by evidence. As with many other science deniers, Matt resorts to baseless conspiracy theories to maintain his position.
And someone with my view in a university would never get funding, would never get published, and would be quite quickly cancelled. Now, I don't think that's healthy. I mean, I'd love to hear. There are other people out there who say there's no carbon dioxide warming, it's all caused by the sun. I think they're wrong too, by the way. But I don't see why they couldn't occasionally be allowed one job in a university or one paper in a journal, which we can then criticize.
Cancel culture, you guys. The ultimate conservative dog whistle. Whine about censorship and cancellation and watch those views climb. Anyway, a shitty paper that contradicts well-established science should not pass peer review just because Matt wants to see good science debunked. That's idiotic, and contrarians do still publish lower quality papers, often in lower tier or off-topic journals. Scientists do critique these papers. Here's a 2015 paper on learning from mistakes in climate research. There were also a group of papers that were published in journals whose target topics were remote from climate research. Editors for these journals may not know of suitable reviewers and may assign reviewers who are not peers within the same scientific field and who do not have the background knowledge needed to carry out a proper review. One well-known example is Richard Lindzen publishing a paper with a very low climate sensitivity estimate. ERBE data appear to demonstrate a climate sensitivity of about 0.5 degrees Celsius. He later admitted the paper contained stupid mistakes. Dr. Linden acknowledged that the 2009 paper contained some stupid mistakes in his handling of the satellite data. It was just embarrassing, he said in an interview. The technical details of satellite measurements are really sort of grotesque. Last year, he tried offering more evidence for his case, but after reviewers for a prestigious American journal criticized the paper, Dr. Lindzen published it in a little-known Korean journal. Dr. Lindzen blames groupthink among climate scientists for his publication difficulties, saying the majority is determined to suppress any dissenting views. They, in turn, contend that he routinely misrepresents the work of other researchers. Moreover, contrarians continued having academic positions and government funding, even after inaccurately downplaying anthropogenic climate change. This includes Richard Lindzen, John Christie, and Roger Pielke Sr. This again contradicts Matt's narrative. Not surprisingly, Matt goes even deeper with his tales of conspiracy and blatant persecution complex.
But I've been blacklisted by the BBC because I once said some of these things on the Today programme, and yet there are so many vested interests now in continuing to talk about it as a crisis and fund it as a crisis that I'll not get a hearing for what I just said.
Yes, all those vested interests. Not like the fossil fuel industry. They couldn't possibly have any agenda in denying climate change and depopularizing their regulation. This is fucking ridiculous. Matt is not being silenced. He writes books. He writes articles in prominent newspapers and magazines. He appears on TV and podcasts and so forth. Once again, he's just playing into conservative tropes regarding censorship and free speech because it works. This is one of the quintessential hallmarks of science-denying grifters. This persecution complex is particularly pathetic coming from a guy who was a member of the House of Lords and who wielded political power on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. Matt is not owed any particular platform, including the BBC. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's common knowledge that he lobbied for coal and made crazy amounts of money from coal. But to be clear, Matt's financial interest in coal was just one factor motivating his climate change denialism. Another motivation is his political ideology, which he cloaks under the label rational optimism. Rational optimism is a misnomer since he engages in irrational optimism that underestimates risks. The motives are painfully transparent. From his blog, the United States, long a beacon of economic libertarianism, is now being offered a choice between two forms of growth-killing, deficit-boosting, zero-sum, big government economic nationalism. Inaccurately downplaying hazards suits his libertarianism by undermining government action targeting those hazards. This includes government policy on not only AGW, but also on pandemics, nutrition science, and beyond. He inaccurately downplays AGW to undermine climate and energy policies he dislikes.
I think it's relatively simple. The advice I'd give was don't set a deadline. I mean, 2050 net zero, UK, only country doing it. We only produce 0.87% of the world's emissions anyway. It won't make a damn bit of difference whether we hit that or not.
Wouldn't make a difference. So let's all do nothing and just keep using fossil fuels, yeah? In his 2013 book, he calls pandemics another scare, like global warming. As the British author Matt Ridley noted in The Rational Optimist, the fashionable reason for pessimism changed, but the pessimism was constant. In the 1990s, pandemics. In the 2000s, global warming. One by one, these scares came, and all but the last went. So, predictably, he was a regular source of misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic, deceptively minimizing risk at almost every turn. In 2020, he opposed lockdowns by claiming that Stockholm, Sweden, achieved herd immunity without a government-imposed lockdown after its first SARS coronavirus 2 wave. He also said Sweden showed a second wave could be avoided without a lockdown. As he wrote in The Spectator, yet Sweden shows that the second wave could have been largely avoided. The New York Times called Sweden a pariah state. The Sun headline read, Sweden's refusal to enter coronavirus lockdown, leaving schools and pubs open, will lead to catastrophe, doctors warn. His claims were then falsified by second waves in Stockholm and in Sweden overall. Waves of infections and deaths are apparently a small price to pay for him to peddle ideologically motivated misinformation on infectious disease epidemiology. From this 2021 paper, therefore, one should not assume that herd immunity has been reached simply because an epidemic has peaked. Indeed, following the first waves of COVID-19, there were suggestions that many countries had achieved herd immunity since cases were in decline. However, serological testing revealed that relatively few people had been infected during the first wave, 5 to 10% in most cases. A resurgence of cases in late 2020 confirmed that herd immunity had not been reached. If you need to see this second wave a little more clearly, here it is. New cases, patients in ICU, new deaths, each shows two clear spikes. Sweden suffered tens of thousands of deaths. It could have been worse, though, if Sweden's government had not intervened after Matt underestimated risk. As noted in Bloomberg in December 2020, the government has rolled out new measures, including a ban on public gatherings of more than 8 people, as well as younger children staying home when a member of the household becomes infected. Additional interventions included a maximum of 4 people in groups at restaurants, a ban on crowding in shopping centers, shops, and gyms, remote or distance instruction at upper secondary schools, the closure of all non-essential state, municipal, and regional services such as swimming baths up until 24 January, libraries, museums, and swimming baths, and recommended use of face masks in public transport at certain times as of 7 January. COVID vaccination also helped avert tens of thousands of deaths in Sweden. To quote a 2025 paper, the number of lives saved by the vaccination program is estimated to be about 31,600, 31,300 to 32,000. So Matt was off by an order of magnitude when he used herd immunity to claim Sweden would suffer just one wave with fewer than 6,000 deaths. The Swedes tested the model against the real world and found it wanting. They decided to forego a lockdown, and fewer than 6,000 have died there. Matt's debunked claims on herd immunity contrast with an accurate assessment from the epidemiologist Neil Ferguson. Neil noted that Sweden had not achieved herd immunity after its first wave and was at significant risk of a second wave. To quote his June 2020 paper, have deaths from COVID-19 in Europe plateaued due to herd immunity. Epidemiological data suggests that no country has yet seen infection rates sufficient to prevent a second wave of transmission, should controls or behavioral precautions be relaxed without compensatory measures in place. Neil's warning was prescient, as we saw with Sweden's second wave that occurred after his paper was published. You know, the one Matt didn't see coming. Yet in 2025, Matt still pretends Sweden proves Neil was wrong. 5 years ago this week, based on a highly misleading model forecast from one academic, Neil Ferguson, the British government ditched its pandemic plan and locked the entire country down with disastrous and, as Sweden proves, unnecessary consequences. Can you say lying, gaslighting piece of shit? Deep down, Matt knows who was really wrong. Matt. He underestimated the risk posed by the pandemic, but of course he brushes that away by blaming the pandemic on a lab leak, with a lab supposedly experimenting on SARS coronavirus 2 in a way that made the virus more contagious. In the early months of 2020, I thought this would happen to COVID too. Like its close cousin SARS in 2003-4, COVID-19 would be relatively easy to stop. I was wrong, and it puzzled me. The lesson, therefore, of the COVID pandemic is that the risk of a natural outbreak going global is probably much smaller than the risk of a lab leak outbreak going global. Another lab leak proponent warned Alina Chan, the co-author of Matt's lab leak book, to not work with Matt because of his poor track record. So should we really believe Matt about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic? He has a dog shit track record on topics like this, and we haven't even gotten to his claims on the origin of the AIDS pandemic. But on the COVID-19 pandemic, Matt said he identified the likely patient zero, Ben Hu, a researcher at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, also known as the WIV. A big moment links Ben Hu, the likely first patient with COVID, to Diffuse, the plan for making a COVID-like virus. Matt wanted to know if intelligence agencies confirmed this. Do we know for sure that the intel agrees Ben Hu was first and not Yuping or Yanzhu? Great question, Matt. The answer is no. The intelligence community, or IC, does not confirm this. To quote a report from the USA's Office of the Director of National Intelligence, several WIV researchers were ill in fall 2019 with symptoms. Some of their symptoms were consistent with, but not diagnostic of, COVID-19. The IC continues to assess that this information neither supports nor refutes either hypothesis of the pandemic's origins, because the researchers' symptoms could have been caused by a number of diseases, and some of the symptoms were not consistent with COVID-19. Oh well, it looks like Matt is also completely unreliable on virology and infectious disease epidemiology. Yet he's so confident that a paper criticizing lab leak claims should be retracted that he's even promoting a petition on it. Retract the proximal origin of SARS coronavirus 2. Sign the petition. Matt has done this sort of thing before to climate scientists, so virologists, you're not alone in having to deal with his bullshit. And it continues. Matt extends his libertarian-tinged paranoia to nutritional epidemiology as well. For example, he opposes government nutritional guidelines by downplaying the risk of saturated fat. From his blog, The American Heart Association, built up into a major force with funding from the vegetable oil industry, relentlessly pushed the message that animal fat was bad. The US government issued guidelines in 1978. We in Europe followed suit, as we tend to do, and the message was driven home in the culture. Low fat became a craze. It still is. Look at supermarket shelves. In the past 10 years, study after rigorous study has found that animal fat per se is not harmful, does not cause obesity, does not raise the kinds of cholesterol that predict heart attacks, does not increase death rate, and is healthier than carbohydrates. Then the Cochrane collaboration contradicted him in its discussion of the health benefits of reducing saturated fat intake. This is a source he has referenced before and generally considers reliable. Roche has now ensured that all 77 trials are in the public domain, so a true assessment of whether Tamiflu works will be made by the Cochrane collaboration, a non-profit research group. But here's what they have to say about saturated fat. The findings of this updated review suggest that reducing saturated fat intake for at least 2 years causes a potentially important reduction in combined cardiovascular events. Replacing the energy from saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat or carbohydrate appear to be useful strategies, while effects of replacement with monounsaturated fat are unclear. What other insanity can we throw on the pile? Oh yeah, he pretended that AIDS was caused by an oral polio vaccine. In terms of establishing cause and effect, it is now rather less speculative than the theory that salt causes high blood pressure. He just packed 2 kinds of stupid into one sentence. Let's take them one at a time. Evidence supports excess salt intake as a causal contributor to high blood pressure, as confirmed in research from the Cochrane collaboration. In white participants, sodium reduction in accordance with the public recommendations resulted in mean arterial pressure decrease of about 0.4 millimeters mercury in participants with normal blood pressure, and an MAP decrease of about 4 millimeters mercury in participants with hypertension. Weak evidence indicated that these effects may be a little greater in Black and Asian participants. Government nutritional guidelines on salt intake and saturated fat intake addressed these risks that Matt underestimated, and the polio vaccine thing Matt promotes was thoroughly debunked. Just another instance of his claims falling apart. Contaminated polio vaccine theory refuted. And we can look at this paper on the phylogeny and origin of HIV-1. This indicates that the structure of HIV-1 phylogenies is the result of epidemiological processes acting within human populations alone, and is not due to multiple cross-species transmission initiated by oral polio vaccination. He did later admit that he was wrong on the origin of the AIDS pandemic, but then he went back to his insane idea because he was mad that experts debunked his claims on the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. Anything else? Of course there is. Matt was chairman of the bank Northern Rock when it experienced a bank run, which is when many depositors suddenly withdraw their funds due to panic about the bank collapsing. This was the first British bank run in a century, and it led to his resignation. The bank was then nationalized, meaning that the government took it over after Matt underestimated risk. So relying on Matt's ideological bias would cost not only lives, but lots of money. Ridley quits as Northern Rock chairman. Mr. Ridley's departure comes a month after the funding crisis that has engulfed Northern Rock exploded into the public arena and caused the first run on a bank in Britain for more than a century. What does Matt do with these repeated failures? Does he reflect on whether something is wrong with his thought process? Of course not. He just continues to engage in conspiratorial anti-establishment thinking. From his blog. Besides, this is just the latest scandal to rock climate science. The biggest was ClimateGate in 2009, which showed scientists conspiring to ostracize skeptics, delete emails, game peer review, and manipulate the presentation of data, including the truncation of a tree ring-derived graph to disguise the fact that it seemed to show recent cooling. The scientists concerned were criticized by 2 rather perfunctory inquiries, but have since taken to saying they were exonerated. His baseless paranoia about climate scientists leaches over to nutrition scientists, epidemiologists, virologists, and so on, causing him to see Lysenkoism where it does not exist. If anything, the evidence shows it is his reasoning that is closer to Lysenkoism. From his blog again. Now, thanks largely to climate science, I have changed my mind. It turns out bad ideas can persist in science for decades, and surrounded by myrmidons of furious defenders, they can turn into intolerant dogmas. This should have been obvious to me. Lysenkoism, a pseudo-biological theory that plants and people could be trained to change their heritable natures, helped starve millions and yet persisted for decades in the Soviet Union, reaching its zenith under Nikita Khrushchev. The theory that dietary fat causes obesity and heart disease, based on a couple of terrible studies in the 1950s, became unchallenged orthodoxy and is only now fading slowly. What these two ideas have in common is that they had political support, which enabled them to monopolize debate. That is especially the case when he finds scientists' evidence-based conclusions to be inconvenient for his ideology. So you should be very skeptical if you see Matt use conspiracy theories about scientists to claim he is right and those scientists are wrong. From his blog again. Despite only moderate social distancing measures, the epidemic stopped growing in Stockholm County by mid-April and has since shrunk significantly, implying that the herd immunity threshold was reached at a point when around 20% of the population was immune, according to estimates by the Swedish Public Health Authority. The almost covert nature of the scientific debate within SAGE, the opaque programming methods of the Imperial team, the unavailability of the code for testing and review at the point of decision, the untested assumptions built into the model, all leave us with a worrying question. Did we base one of the biggest peacetime policy decisions on crude mathematical guesswork? He does this all over Twitter. His pseudo-skepticism should be rejected. And of course, we can finish by taking a look at the bigger picture. All of this rhetoric we have been discussing is directly aligned with the agenda of the Trump administration, which is outright climate change denial. A new climate assessment report was recently published, authored by the Climate Working Group, or CWG. Its 5 authors are listed here, and as plenty of people have pointed out, all 5 of them have appeared on outlets like Fox News to promote climate misinformation, and this is just another instance of Trump exclusively appointing frauds who hold views that are directly antithetical to the purpose of the position they are given. 3 of the 5 of them have issued predictions that already have failed, and the other 2 claimed models overestimated warming and that there was a pause in warming, which has been firmly disproven. From a Wired article, "These guys have a history of being wrong on important scientific issues," Santer says. "The notion that their views have been given short shrift by the scientific community is just plain wrong." Then in Nature, this little report is basically designed to suppress science, not to enhance it or encourage it, says Joe Allen Russell, an oceanographer at the University of Arizona. It's awful. Then from The Guardian, this report had 5 authors and was rushed over 4 months and would not pass muster in any traditional scientific peer review process, said Zeke Housefather, a research scientist at the climate nonprofit Berkeley Earth, who called the paper a farce. Scientists continue to go page by page through the report, exposing its false and misleading information as described in Carbon Brief. More than 100 false or misleading claims, highlighted in red and orange respectively. As you can see, the whole thing is pretty orange indeed, much like our commander-in-chief. The authors of this climate report misrepresent the research they discuss and have a long history of being wrong, as many of their colleagues note. So what does that mean for the EPA? Well, look at that. The EPA is planning to revoke its 2009 finding that 6 greenhouse gases endanger public health and must therefore be regulated under the Clean Air Act. Just another pillar of state-sanctioned science denial for the Trump administration. Is there any aspect of civic duty that Trump won't take a big steamy dump on? Chew on that rhetorical question until 2028. As that was quite a bit of information, let's get some context by speaking with an expert in the field, climate scientist Andrew Dessler, professor of atmospheric sciences at Texas A&M. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. My viewers just sat through a barrage of 2 hours of data and papers and all that, so not to get too in-depth here, but I thought it would be worth our time to hear the perspective of an expert in this field. I just wanted to discuss the very basics. How rapid is warming occurring? How confident are we in with that data? How dangerous is it? And what can we do about it? Let's talk about it.
Okay, so when you ask the question, how fast is it warming? There are lots of different ways to answer that question. So one way to answer is I can say we've warmed about 1.3 degrees Celsius, so about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, over the last 150 years. And we're on track for probably a degree and a half Celsius, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit of warming over the rest of the century. Although we control that. So humans have the ability to modulate how much warming we have. Now, a different way to answer that question is when comparing that to sort of historical rates of warming and historical amounts of warming. And as far as we can tell, this is warming extremely quickly. So let me give you one yardstick. When we came out of the last ice age, we reached the depths of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago, and we essentially entered, we call the Holocene, the modern, very warm period that we're enjoying right now, about 10,000 years ago. So over a course of about 10,000 years, the Earth warmed probably about 6 degrees Celsius. So about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So what we're talking about here is warming half of that much in one or two centuries. So this is an incredibly fast rate of warming. And so when people say stuff like, well, the climate always varies, I mean, that's true, but it's varying really rapidly now. And the faster the variation is, the harder it's going to be for us to adapt. If it was going to warm 3 degrees over a million years, I wouldn't care about that at all. But 3 degrees over a century, people alive today are going to live through this, and all our infrastructure is going to be there. And I mean, this is an extremely fast rate of warming.
And we're quite confident that greenhouse gas emissions are the main culprit here.
Yeah, let me sort of step back and just say that climate science is, in my opinion, the most scrutinized and reproduced science in history because of the economic implications. So when I tell you that we are sure that adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is warming the climate, we are sure of this, as sure as you can be of anything in science. I mean, the pedant will say, well, science is always open to being disproven. That's right. But certain things effectively are facts. The Earth is round. That's a fact. DNA is a double helix. That's pretty close to being a fact. And humans are warming the climate by adding greenhouse gases, these gases that absorb infrared radiation or heat. That's a fact.
And so if we do not make any changes with our behavior globally, economically, industrially, what are we on track to see? What will, will this be in 20 years, in 70 years? Is it going to be primarily sea level rise or catastrophic weather patterns? What are we in for?
Well, going back to my ice age analogy, it's useful for people to have a yardstick of how much warming we have. So the last ice age was about 6 degrees Celsius cooler than present day. We're talking about warming of 3 degrees Celsius, sort of that's our business as usual amount. That's half of an ice age of warming. And think about how different the Earth was in an ice age. So you go from an ice age to the Holocene, where we are now, that's 6 degrees, and that's a completely different world. So we're talking about half of that in an incredibly short amount of time. This is going to literally remake the surface of the planet. And so I mean, you're going to walk out your front door and you may not recognize where you live because the assemblages of plants and animals, the climate, the seasons, they're all going to be completely different in a 3-degree world. That is a completely different world. And let me just emphasize something I tell all my students, they're going to live through this. I may not, but the students are. And anybody that's watching this that's in high school or in college, this is your future. You have skin in the game in ways that the old congressional, our congressmen who are 80 years old, they don't have skin in the game in the same way. So if you're a young person, this should concern you. This should concern you. So what are the concrete effects? Well, the most direct effect of adding greenhouse gas to the atmosphere is temperature goes up. You trap heat. That's just basic first law of thermodynamics. But then all sorts of other knock-on effects happen. So you mentioned sea level rise. So sea level rise is in the future is primarily going to be because we're melting ice. And when you melt ice that's sitting on land, we're not talking floating ice, but grounded ice, you melt it, that water runs in the ocean, increases the amount of water in the ocean, sea level goes up. There's a bit of a contribution from thermal expansion, that we're warming the oceans and the oceans expand when they warm. But in the future, it's mainly going to be melting of grounded ice. So that's a concrete effect. Then there's changes in precipitation. Again, we are 100%, or maybe not 100%, 99% certain that humans are already changing patterns of precipitation, and we're making extreme events more extreme. So when you look around the world and you see a rain event, and the people are saying, we've never seen anything like that. You've never seen anything like that because your experience is with a climate that no longer exists. The climate we have now, nobody's ever lived through this. And so things are happening that haven't happened before. So precipitation, we can expect to see more what we call hydrologic variability. So when it rains, it's going to rain harder, and then you have a longer period without rain. And because the temperatures are higher, you have more evaporation. So you can also expect more dry periods. So you end up with this paradoxical situation that both ends of the extremes get more extreme. You have more flooding and you have more dry droughts and things like that. So let's talk about hurricanes, because people always want to talk about the climate connection to hurricanes. So just from basic physics, we can tell that hurricanes are going to rain more because as the planet warms, there's more water vapor in the atmosphere. And so hurricanes are going to produce more rain. So you're going to have more things like Hurricane Harvey. In addition, hurricanes are coming on shore, sea level's higher. And that means that the storm surge is going to be higher because whatever the storm surge is riding on top of the ocean. So as they say, a rising tide floats all boats. A rising tide also floats all hurricanes. So it makes hurricanes more destructive. Now, the one thing we don't know about I should say the intensity of hurricanes. If a hurricane forms, it's going to be more intense. Again, it's just thermodynamics. Now, the thing we don't know is the number of hurricanes. We don't have a good theory for what controls the total number of hurricanes. There's about 80 hurricanes every year around the world, and we don't really know why it's 80 and not 8 or not 800. We have no theory for that. It's something people are working on. And so in models, we see some evidence that the numbers might be going down. Other models, maybe they're not. We really don't know. And so that's an uncertainty in hurricane science. I think I don't know how I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. So unless there's something specific.
Yeah, to me, it's like the issue is that the public isn't looking at all this data, so they maybe aren't aware of how anomalous a lot of this stuff is. But like, what is it going to take? Like Miami and New Orleans becoming completely submerged for people to kind of go, oh, okay, actually, this is really happening right now. Then all of the secondary ramifications of species that can't adapt rapidly enough to an amount of warming that they could have adapted over 10,000 years, but not over 150 years or something.
Right.
And then what are the complex ramifications there that disrupts all of these food webs and everything. But what are we like? That's the main battle. I feel like the science is clear and the scientific consensus is clear. So the barrier to the public is just these figures that kind of promote the climate skepticism. What do you say to the people who maybe have fallen victim to some of this rhetoric and are repeating this rhetoric about no, warming is not happening that rapidly, it's not that dangerous, it's not an issue? Is there something that we can do to stir within them this realization?
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question. And I think that the first thing you have to understand is that when people make arguments about the science of climate change, they're almost never arguing about the science. So in public debates, science is a proxy for the underlying policy battle. So it's, how do you feel about regulation on fossil fuels? How do you feel about renewable energy? How do you feel about, government? The government telling people what to do. That's really the proxy. And that's why, you see such a strong correlation between people who don't believe in climate change and people who are, for want of a better term, sort of these libertarians who don't want any government action. And one of the things I've noted is that if you ask somebody about their opinion about climate change and their opinion about something like Obamacare, which is sort of this government program to give people health care, you find essentially 100% correlation between people who don't believe climate change and don't support Obamacare. I mean, it's these political views are always very well correlated, and it's because that's the problem. So if you try to argue the science with somebody like that, not only does it not work, but it actually makes them angry because they don't care about the science. They're doing this because this is their viewpoint about how the world should work. And if you argue with them, you're stressing them because it's like, I want to believe the world works this way. And if you give me facts that tell me it doesn't work this way, I'm angry. And so it's really hard to convince somebody who really doesn't believe in, who sort of actively disbelieves climate change. And so I personally don't make a big effort to talk to them because it's just not a good use of my time. I find it's better to talk to people who don't have an opinion. And then, those are the people that you can explain, here's the issues. And I think this is very important for all of your viewers to understand. This is a solvable problem. We understand how to generate energy without producing greenhouse gases. It's called solar and wind. And solar and wind are now our cheapest energy. And I understand they're intermittent. But believe it or not, engineers have spent a decade figuring out how do we run a grid on intermittent wind and solar. And so, Texas now is a third wind and solar over the year. And, 25 years ago, people would have said that's impossible. You can't run a grid that's more than like 1% variable renewable because it's going to crash the grid. Well, now we're at a third. And again, we can clearly go a lot further on this. So this is not a scientific problem. This is not a technical problem. This is a political problem. Yeah. It all goes back to fossil fuel interests. Mm-hmm. Fossil fuel interests are probably the most powerful special interest in the history of the world. It's a $10 trillion a year business. And if you think they're not going to go down swinging, you're crazy. They have 10 trillion reasons to push back on the science. It's like the tobacco case where, you look like you may be too young to remember. There was a time when, there was this debate over whether smoking causes cancer or not. Mm-hmm. And, there was a very similar to the debate today. The tactics are similar. And it was basically because they wanted to maintain the social license to sell cigarettes and oil and gas want to maintain their market share. And it's especially hard for them because it's a better, cheaper alternative. So they not only have to convince the public that it's okay, but then they have to figure out some way to hamstring renewable energy, which unfortunately the U.S. administration seems to be going along with.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to know, like such a huge sector of the public that is so cagey about the concept of government regulation of anything, right? They've been programmed with this script of, regulation is communism and communism is bad and so on and so forth. It's like, it should be so easy to help people understand if a company is dumping toxic sludge into the river, is that good? No, it's not. What should we do? Maybe a government should enforce laws to make sure that they can't do that, right? It should be very easy to connect these dots and go, there needs to be a government to police the private sector.
Right, but you know what happens? The company that's dumping sludge into the river then makes a giant payment to the politician, right? And then the politician gets up and gives speeches about job killing regulation, and we don't want the government telling us what to do. If I want to drink sludge, I should be able to. And so it's all the stuff that we see every day in here about that. But I 100% agree with you.
And so that's what I see. Like, that's my job. That's how I view my role in all of this, is to help the public, help deprogram the public, help them spot that rhetoric, understand the fallaciousness of that rhetoric, and disengage from anyone who talks that way. You're being bamboozled, So. Yeah, trying to push the needle on this side.
And really, we need to, talk to the people who have skin in the game. As I say, anybody who's, 20 years old or around there, you guys are going to live through this century. This is your future. And if we get 3 degrees of warming, 3 degrees Celsius, 5 Fahrenheit, It's going to be a bad ride. I cannot imagine it's going to be like, oh, that wasn't so bad. Oh, it's going to be bad. And so you have a lot of incentive to do something about it and not let people tell you it's too expensive or renewables can't power our society. They're not expensive. They can power our society.
Yeah, the science is there. We've made the progress. It's just a bunch of red tape.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that will serve as a nice bookend to this video. They got a lot of papers slammed in their faces, but this is just put so clearly and from someone who works in this field. Yeah, any last message or words here?
Yeah, you know, what I tell my students, don't be depressed about this, but be mad. Be mad because there are a lot of people in various state legislatures in Washington that are selling your future down the river for that sweet fossil fuel money. And, you know, you should not let them get away with it. We can have a world that has abundant energy and clean energy. We can do that if the people would just stop selling us out.
Mm-hmm. Words of wisdom. Yes. Hopefully this piece makes a little noise and pushes the needle a little bit. But yeah, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, I'll keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks, Andrew. So what are we left with? Well, for those who made it through this video, ideally an ability to counter rhetoric such as lukewarmism to some degree. Some people are so far gone that they can't be helped. For anyone who thinks science is the devil, no amount of science will set them straight. But people like Matt Ridley are dangerous because they present themselves as reasonable and science-based. They appeal to those who are unsure of how to approach the topic and can be captured by convincing lies. Those are the folks who must be made aware of the fallacies Matt commits and others like him. That we do see positive feedback, that warming is indeed headed to dangerous territory, and that it can certainly be catastrophic in the relatively near future if we don't do something about it now. Without public pressure, the bureaucracy will run as usual, and nothing will ever get done. While we may not have overarching solutions, spreading the truth is always the first step. So that's it for Matt Ridley, the shameless liar, and his disgusting lies about climate change. You know what they say, never trust a coal man about the climate, or if they don't, maybe we should start saying it now. Fingers crossed that this video makes some waves among climate change deniers, in which case you might hear from me on this topic again soon. Until next time.